Okay, so this is my 1997 Ford passenger van. It is a club wagon, although it's basically the same as the E150, Econoline 150. And I believe the E250s and E350s have a similar situation for the rear shocks. Replacing rear shocks is generally a pretty simple thing. On these guys, it is not. And so I spent a couple hours banging around trying to figure out a good way to do this, and this is the way I came up with. So let's get it going. The reason it's hard is because of this top stud nut situation. So you've got the stud here for the shock, and then the shock continues down under the frame. There's no room to work in here. There's no room to get that nut off. Um, it's pretty much impossible. I spent about half an hour just trying to get a wrench on it, much less turn it, a fraction of an inch before you run into the frame or the floor. So couldn't really do that. So just to get it started here, uh, what I did was get the back of the van jacked up, get some jack stands in, leave myself a little bit of room to work at these bottom shock um, supports right here. Sprayed the bolts top and bottom down with some penetrating catalyst to help break them free if they were going to be real rusty. The thing that worked for me was pull the wheels off and then get under and pull the bottoms of the shocks off, let them hang loose. I did try yanking them back and forth to see if I could just break the studs off the top. I'd seen somebody else do that. I could not do it. The guy I saw do it had the advantage of having the car up on a lift, and he was able to really put his whole body into it. And I think his were probably more rusted out than mine were, but I tried yanking on those, and I could not get enough leverage to get them to snap off. So if you can do it, great. I couldn't. Back to that pesky top stud there. What you're going to want to do, what I did, just got a box end wrench that I was able to get in on that nut. And then my plan was to turn the shock from the bottom, let that wrench just wedge up against the floor or the frame or wherever it decided it wanted to wedge into. So I just got it kind of set there and used my super special pipe wrench to start getting that thing off. So the way I did it is I had that wrench up on top, got my pipe wrench on this top portion of the shock here, and just started turning it with a pipe wrench until the wrench that's sitting on that nut on top wedged into a nice spot. Then I was able to just kind of keep turning the shock itself and at the same time loosening that top stud from the nut. So that worked. I got both of them off that way. The rubber grommets were left in the holes, so I had to get up with a pair of pliers and just rip the rest of that old rubber out. And I got my new shock. It came with these parts, kind of this cap washer, a rubber grommet, another cap washer, a rubber grommet, and a nut. I put it together here to see how it was going to go. There was no instructions, but right here would be where the uh, stud goes through the frame. Use the metal cap nut on the bottom, rubber, and then on the top you're going to use the rubber, metal cap nut, and then nut. So I went ahead, just left the bottom on here. The cap washer, the rubber, got the stud up through the hole. Went ahead from there and just set the bottom of the shock. Got the bolt through, just loosely set that nut on just to keep everything in place. And then that's tightening the bottom of that shock there, which that's kind of out of order. I did that later. But then this was tricky, getting the rubber kind of grommet, that cap, and then the nut on and started. Tricky because you got to kind of get back in there with your fingers. There's really no room to do it. I used one hand to kind of pull that shock. These are gas shocks. I used one hand to pull that shock down so that stud came down, and then kind of slipped them on top in that fashion. Get that nut slipped up on top too, and just get it started with your fingers. And then same kind of deal. Once you have that nut on, set a box end wrench over the nut again. Just kind of get it in a place where it's going to wedge somewhere on the body. And then I just spun the top of the shock with my hand in order to get the nut to tighten. This worked fine with the gas shock. I don't know if it'll work with spring shocks. For some reason, on the gas shock, you can just spin that top portion of the shock and the stud at the same time, and it doesn't hurt anything inside the shock. So I just spun that until I got the nut as tight as I could get it by hand. Then used a ratcheting box end to get on that top nut and just finish it off with several little micro turns until it was nice and tight. Then just threw the wheels back on, and done and done. I hope that helps other people who want to do this. I did a lot of research and wasn't really able to find a good resource on how the heck to do that job. So this job took me 2 hours, 15 minutes. If I had to do it again, I think it could be an hour, because I spent quite a bit of time fussing around with other methods, trying to get them to work before I landed on this. So